blood flow restriction therapy, the most incredible innovation in exercise therapy in the last century, was developed in Japan nearly 60 years ago, but stuck in Japan until literally this last decade before it was transferred to the United States. There's a fascinating history of how and why it got to the United States, and the innovations that had to occur before it could be more widely adopted and available to everyone so they can get all these incredible metabolic benefits.
When I met Dr. Sato, he said to me very softly, he's a very humble man, very soft voice, and he says, "Oh, I was waiting for you." And I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "I didn't even know about you until 3 days ago." And he said, "Well, I've been anxious to share this with the rest of the world." He says, "I think everybody in the world should be doing Katsu." Dr. Sato and the researchers theorized that it was replicating heavy exercise, and therefore the HGH, the human growth hormones, were being secreted, and that was leading to increased muscle tone or increased muscle mass. I have no problem putting this on my parents. They're 82 and 83. They use Katsu daily, sometimes twice a day. They have their own unit. Their muscular form is great. They're very active. My mother uses it in the pool and for her arthritis. My father uses it for his varicose veins and while riding a bike. They've used Katsu through hip replacements, knee replacements, etc. They do not go to a physical therapist after their surgeries. They just come home and they know how to use the Katsu bands themselves. That was my original goal. How can I help my own parents as they age to remain as active in my children's life, their grandchildren's lives as possible? And it's so far proved an immense benefit.
Welcome everyone. This is Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health. And today we're going to talk about one of my most exciting new discoveries, and that is blood flow restriction training, which I perceive to be the greatest innovation in exercise training in the last century, or maybe even longer. So I've got a lot of videos and written information on that, but briefly, it's one of the reasons I'm so excited is it provides a practical tool, a resource that virtually everyone can use to get the benefits of conventional strength training, which uses really heavy weights, typically 70 to 85% of your 1 rep max, which can be significant, and precludes that from most elderly people because they just can't lift that heavy a weight. So blood flow restriction training done properly will provide almost all the benefits and then some. And we'll probably touch what some of those benefits are later, but we have the person who is responsible for bringing this marvelous innovation to the United States, because it was developed by a Japanese professor, Sato, in 1966, and remained in Japan, still is to this day, until literally this decade. So Steven Munatones, who is on with us now, is going to share his story. And I think it's really important because this, to me, is a major historical landmark, bringing Katsu, which is the name that Dr. Sato described to blood flow restriction training, to the United States. If it wasn't for Steven, we probably wouldn't be talking about this now because it would still be restricted to Japan. And a lot of it has to do with the Japanese culture. Steven speaks fluent Japanese, and I'll let him tell your story specifically, but he was basically the intermediary that facilitated the bringing this blood flow restriction training to the United States. So welcome and thank you for joining us, Steven.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, well, I am so grateful that you provided this radical innovation to the United States. Obviously, you didn't invent it, but you facilitated the introduction, and it was a long and painful process. So I want you to give your backstory, your history, how this whole story happened, because the world needs to know, because I'm convinced that blood flow restriction therapy training is going to explode, and they need to know how it got here and why.
Yes. Well, Dr. Sato, as you said, invented it in 1996. And then when
1966, right?
I'm sorry, 1966, I apologize. And for the next 7 years, he experimented on himself. And why did he discover it? He was actually at a Buddhist ceremony, sitting on his heels. And he felt his calf get very, very tight, just as if you did some heel raises with the barbell on your shoulders. And he was thinking, gosh, my calves are tightening up. What could that physiological process be? One thing led to another. Over 7 years, he experimented with bicycle tubes. He experimented with every kind of strain and strand and rope that he had. He put bands on his legs, around his waist, in his chest, arm, forearm, even his forehead, to figure out what he thought was restricting the blood flow. But
he was a human guinea pig.
He was a human guinea pig for 7 years. He kept meticulous notes, and how he judged success was the muscle mass increasing. Initially, that was his parameter. And he would do various things. And ultimately, after 7 years, he found out that if you put bands on the upper arms and upper legs of the human body, not only could you improve your muscle mass, but also your strength and your performance. During this 7-year period, he did not do KAATSU on anybody. It was just a self-experimentation. Then he figured, hey, a lot of other people need to do it. So he started a very small office just west of Tokyo, within the Tokyo confines. And he continued to treat people over the next 20 years. And over those next 20 years, he found out other things. He started to work with other researchers. He started working with cardiovascular surgeons, with internists, with endocrinologists, etc. All of this information was limited to Japan in the Japanese language. And so all of this data, all of this clinical research, the academic research was all limited to Japan, basically Tokyo, and the University of Tokyo Hospital, where he had colleagues. And so come 2001, I was asked, because of my linguistic abilities in Japanese, to be a swimming coach for the US national swim team at the World Championships that were in Japan. And that's when I first found out about Dr. Sato. And the Japanese coaches introduced me to Dr. Sato. I visited his office in Tokyo. I saw a huge line of people waiting to see him at his office. And the people would come out quite happy. I'd ask them in Japanese, how do you feel? They say, I feel great. I asked them how they felt before, and they felt a strain in my back, or I had broken my finger, or a variety of injuries and ailments. And so when I met Dr. Sato, he said to me very softly, he's a very humble man, very soft voice, and he says, oh, I was waiting for you. And I said, oh, really? I said, I didn't even know about you until 3 days ago. And he said, well, I've been anxious to share this with the rest of the world. He says, I think everybody in the world should be doing KAATSU. I said, well, Dr. Sato, why haven't you shared this with the rest of the world? And he said, well, there's 2 reasons. I don't speak English, and I don't travel outside of Japan. And so I said, well, I do those 2 things. And I said, well, I'd like to learn. I want to try this. I want to learn about it. I was not thinking about business at all. I was merely thinking about myself and my parents, because I saw all these people going to Dr. Sato's office, and they were all elderly by, I would say, over the age of 50. And I was in my mid-40s at the time. And he said, great, please come and I'll teach you everything. I want this information to be shared with the world. So I said, Dr. Sato, I have to go back to the United States, but I'll come back shortly. He says, great, we'll take all the time you need, and I'll share this with you. Well, that training period took 13 years.
Yeah.
It was a very Japanese mentorship. I learned everything. I learned how to wrap the bands, what to look at a person physiologically. We went into the research labs. We used Doppler machines, ultrasound machines. We tested and prodded and poked people with blood samples before and after KAATSU. So he really wanted me to learn what was the mechanism of KAATSU. And that's what I did for 13 years. And now at the 13th year, I visited Japan for the 4th time. I was going to Japan 4 times a year, visiting Dr. Sato.
So that's over 50 visits to Japan.
Yes.
To allow that technology and information to be transferred to the United States.
Correct. And remember, when I first met Dr. Sato, there was no information written. It was all in his head, and he had shared it at that time with about, I would say, 20 physicians or 20 academic researchers. And it was all just clinical information. There was no how-to book. So I had to write a how-to book. I had to capture the information in his head and what he showed me and explained to me, and make English words for that, because there was no English word. The only word that I kept the same was the original Japanese word, which is Katsu, and it's formed by 2 Japanese characters, Ka, which means additional, and ATSU, which means pressure. So it's the additional pressure that the band and the equipment is placing on the limbs. And so everything else, all the words, all the explanation of KAATSU, we translated over the 13-year period. And he wanted to make sure if I was the one that was going to share this with the rest of the world, that I had at least as much information as possible in my brain and in English to share it with the rest of the world.
Well, that's quite a story, and quite a perseverance to persist for 13 years and at 4 trips a year to Asia, which is quite a trek. I mean, that's not a domestic flight at all, of course, and a lot of time and effort. So can we maybe discuss the next step is which actually formation of the company in the United States and supplying the equipment to perform this?
Yes. So when Dr. Sato is a very clever man, he's not an engineer. And so I had lived in Japan for 7 years previously, working in Hitachi's R&D labs, and I had those skill sets as to how to develop a machine, how to create a product that attempted to replicate what Dr. Sato was doing with his own hands. And so we took, after Dr. Sato said, okay, you're ready, let's form a company.
Let me stop you there, because this is new information to me. So when you said what he was doing with his own hands, could you describe what the early work in the prior to year 2000 was? Did he have a manual blood pressure pump, or how was he getting these cuffs inflated?
Yeah. So from 1966 to I would say around 2000, he simply used elastic bands.
Wow.
They were very elastic, and they were very, very long. And so literally he would wrap the bands around the upper arms and upper legs. And when I saw this, and when he would apply it to many people, it was a very laborious effort. You'd wrap and you unwrap. You'd wrap and you unwrap over and over again over the course of 20 minutes. And if you see 10, 15, 20 patients a day, he would literally be dripping in sweat. And so my engineering mind said, well, Dr. Sato, we could create some bands, some machines that would automatically replicate that. Now, in order to do that, there was this step. How tight were the bands? What was that measure of elasticity? What was that tensile strength there? So there was a lot of engineering work that was done in between the age of just these elastic bands to the age of where we are now with pneumatic bands. And I always laugh when the academic researchers and the cardiologists, et cetera, asked Dr. Sato very specifically, what is that pressure we had to find a measurement, a unit of measurement that was understandable to everybody. So Dr. Sato simply went to the auto parts location, and he bought a little device that measured pressure, air pressure, and he put it on the arms. And so in the early days, what we did was we used these elastic bands. However, we put this little device that told us what was that external pressure on the limb. And so we had to do more testing to figure out, okay, how do we keep that pressure consistent and uniform if we did eventually sell thousands and tens of thousands of machines around the world? So there was some engineering effort in there. And then gradually, as the science developed, as we were understanding that the real benefit here, or the most profound mechanism, was actually increasing the elasticity of our vascular system. Then we went into, I'll call the second generation. And
why don't you have you stop there and explain what you just said, because it's a bit confusing.
Yes. So originally, when we would do KAATSU, anybody, it didn't matter if it was a young man in Dr. Sato or a 60, 70, 80, 90-year-old, we were seeing increased muscle tone or increased muscle mass. So we, Dr. Sato and the researchers, theorized that it was replicating heavy exercise, and therefore the HGH, the human growth hormones, were being secreted, and that was leading to increased muscle tone or increased muscle mass. But as we started to study more and more with MRI machines, Doppler devices, ultrasound, we realized that it was actually the strength or the elasticity of the three vascular walls, the inner, middle, and outer walls of our capillaries and veins, that were becoming more elastic. And when that happened, there was a subsequent or a secondary hormonal response. And now we understand it as science has advanced. Now there's a lot of different very healthful metabolites that are being generated because of this increased elasticity of the capillaries and veins.
So what is your perception of there's so many metabolic hormonal responses from this exercise, but which ones are you referring to specifically with this elasticity of the blood vessels?
The endothelial cells was the original one. Again, this is not my specialty, but it was the specialties of the doctors that were in the University of Tokyo Hospital. They saw that increase in endothelial cells because cardiologists were, all of the patients that I was looking at and I was studying under them were people who had cardiac issues. This is a very important point regarding safety. So sometimes as the story of KAATSU and blood flow restrictions transferred from Japan to the United States to Europe and the rest of the world, there was a focus on muscle growth. There was a focus on you can get bigger, stronger, faster. And that is true. However, all of that fundamental research was done under the work of Dr. Sato and Dr. Nakajima and Dr. Morita specifically, cardiologists at the University of Tokyo Hospital. And our patients, or their patients, were actually people who had heart attacks, strokes, heart bypass surgeries, and other things. Those were the doctor's patients. And so dealing with people with cardiac issues absolutely required for us to be, number one, safe. And having this pneumatic bands that were under a controlled pressure and quite gentle, and with people who they couldn't even get out of bed, let alone do push-ups in the beginning. So we had to be very gentle and very safe, and we were still seeing increased muscle tone. So they were the ones, because of their specialty, that first identified the increased production of endothelial cells. And then it led to other metabolites that they concluded it was the increase of the vascular wall, increase in the elasticity of the capillary walls that led to a variety of other effects.
Now, I'm a bit confused because after studying this, I come to a different conclusion. But clearly, the endothelial function is radically improved, which is why it's being used in Tokyo. not this country yet, but in Tokyo and many other places in Japan for cardiac rehab. But not because of the elasticity, but because the creating a hypoxic environment where there's a relatively low oxygen tension when the bands are compressed and you're exercising the muscle, and that catalyzes HIF-1 alpha, hypoxic inducible factor 1 alpha, which catalyzes VEGF, which is the strongest angiogenic signal your body could possibly produce. Very powerful fertilizer for the capillary growth and endothelial cells specifically. That's why it's called vascular endothelial growth factor. So isn't it this, is it more likely to be the mechanism, or is this elasticity that you're referring to?
Yes, you explained it much more eloquently than I did. Much more eloquently.
Okay, well, and it's not that I figured this out. I mean, it's really clear in the literature. And, you know, because, let me just preface why I'm so fascinated with this. I didn't explain it earlier. I purchased a unit in May of 2019 and was just astounded, literally astounded. I had played with it before, listening to Jim Stray Gunderson, but didn't get it. I just used regular stupid bands. I didn't know what I was doing. That was 2 years previously, but I finally got the KAATSU equipment. I used it. Unbelievable results. And I said, this works. And I didn't really get the benefits from what your company was telling me. So I just dug into the literature, read hundreds and hundreds of articles on it. And there's a lot of well-documented, well-published research on this. And it really explains at a very detailed level what the heck is happening and why it works.
Yeah, and that research and study is still continuing.
Yeah, they didn't stop.
And because, for example, because of the cost of the original equipment, it was pricey, without a doubt. It was pricey.
Yeah. It was like $5,000 or maybe even more when it first came out.
When it first came out, it was actually $16,000.
Okay, $16,000.
And so again, the early equipment was very large. It, like anything that an engineered product, we make it better and better, and generally smaller, and easier and easier for the average person to use. But in the beginning, because it was so expensive, people were not using it on a daily basis. And suddenly, as our product was getting less expensive, people were using it more on a daily basis. And they saw even more increase. And it actually took some paraplegics and quadriplegics to really open our eyes as to what is possible. Because these people felt so much better because, again, being paraplegic, they have portions of their body or all of their limbs that are immobile for a variety of reasons, but we were still using the bands on these individuals. They started to use KAATSU 2 or 3 times a day. And again, we saw another incremental shift in their improvement.
So let me just be clear. Because people would be wondering, how could they use it if you're going to be doing weight training? This was just the cycling they were doing. You were putting the unit on, it was pumping air in, correct, maintaining the pressure, and then releasing it, repeating it multiple times.
Correct. And then what their caregivers would do, what we call passive exercise. Mm-hmm. So they put the bands on, the air would go in for 20 seconds, release for 5 seconds, in for 20 seconds, release for 5, as the caregiver would be lifting their arm or moving their leg.
Okay, passively.
And then we saw the people, and through Dr. Sato's work with the cardiac therapy patients, he would always advise them through me to try to move their arm. And suddenly we had quadriplegics who, started to go like this and started to go like this. Their spasmodic conditions were now released. They were able to move their hands a little bit. They weren't necessarily able to suddenly walk, but that simple movement drastically increased their quality of life. Mm-hmm. So as we continue to go along this journey, we continue to explore different mechanisms, different metabolites that are being produced. And to this day, we are still learning. Dr. Sato and all the Japanese are still learning. We're still pushing the envelope as to what is possible.
Okay, so I want to go back to the early days because I'm curious as to the transition. So you developed this large machine, $16,000 at the initial implementation, which is now down to $800. It's called
Correct.
Cycle 2.0. clearly it's the size of a deck of cards, maybe 2 deck of cards. It's pretty tiny, and basically performs everything the individual would need it to do. So if you're a professional, you might need a higher level equipment, but any end user only needs the small one. So it's down to that price. But when you develop the unit, you mentioned that he was wrapping his patients with these elastic wraps. At what point did he convert over to using these mechanized units? And I assume, I don't know because I haven't asked previously, that they're in Japan, they're all using these mechanized units now, or at least Dr. Katsu.
So about 2005, the machine was, the first prototypes were made, and they went into market in about 2006. So that was the transition from the elastic bands manually put on, non-pneumatic, to some pneumatic bands that were, I'll call them semi-automated at that point.
Okay, good.
And so there are still some, and remember at this time, there was only a handful of practitioners in Japan. Once the shift made from the non-pneumatic, manually applied elastic bands to the semi-automatic pneumatic bands that physicians and physical therapists could actually dial in this specific pressure, then that increased to thousands of practitioners in Japan, from chiropractors and physical therapists to physicians of all sorts.
Yeah. Now, I want you to go into some details and explain the manufacturing processes of constructing these bands, because just superficially, they appear to be pretty simple. I mean, almost everyone has seen and had a blood pressure cuff applied to their arm. And they're probably thinking, well, just make a thinner blood pressure cuff. It would be great if it was that simple, but apparently it's not. And there's a lot of complexities to this. So I'd like you to walk us through how that band was constructed, because it's not intuitive that this is a really complex band and why it costs so much to manufacture and charge for.
Correct. So the band itself has an air bladder inside, and that air bladder only is inflated to one side. So imagine a balloon. When you blow up a balloon, it expands uniformly. When we blow up the KAATSU band, it does not expand uniformly. It expands in one direction, the direction toward your skin. And that
does a blood pressure cuff blow up symmetrically too? Or
no, it actually just squeezes. It's an inflexible piece of plastic that squeezes the arm. And I wish I had the blood pressure cuff, but it's quite, it covers the whole of the upper arm.
It's a tourniquet.
It's a tourniquet. And
yeah, so I'll let you continue, but differentiate between a tourniquet and what the KAATSU bands is, because that is a massive and vitally important piece of information that you have to understand if you're going to make a decision how you're going to implement this program.
Correct. People say, oh, that looks like a blood pressure cuff. That looks like a tourniquet. And outwardly it does, except the tourniquet keeps the blood out. It occludes momentarily, so the physician or the nurse can check your blood pressure. The KAATSU bands are specifically designed to keep the blood in. On a practical basis, it reduces the venous flow back from the limb to the torso.
Almost completely obstructs the venous flow.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't completely obstruct it. We call it blood flow modification because there is always blood going in and there is always blood coming out. And
that's when your muscle is contracting, right?
Correct.
So if it's not contracting, it's not returning.
Correct.
But the elasticity and the pressure allows it to actually return some of the blood.
Correct. And that's why the cycle, pressure on, pressure off, pressure on, pressure off, enables that blood flow to continue, the arterial flow in and the venous flow out. And that is very important. So when a person does KAATSU, the palm of their hands or their feet become very pink, even a rosy, a beefy red. And some athletes and very fit people, it actually turns a deep purple because what's happening is all that blood is going in and is being modified coming out. So there's what we call blood pooling in the limb. And that is the catalyst for a bunch of metabolite hormonal responses in the body.
Okay, great. But I guess here is a good point to transition into alternative devices that are being implemented, but in some cases, primarily physical therapists. You know, health professionals. Almost all new physical therapists now are PhDs. I mean, they're clearly professionals, no question, and well studied and very good at what they do. But and I want you to discuss this. It's a really important thing. And I'm going to actually interview one of the leaders and one of the leading physical therapists shortly that teaches this. But they, for some reason, have embraced is the best word I was searching for, the pre-existing surgical tourniquets that are used in surgery to completely obstruct blood flow in a limb so the surgeons can operate on them. And they have FDA approval, so they can be used by a clinician for anything else that they deem appropriate. And mostly physical therapists have deemed it's appropriate to implement blood flow obstruction therapy, which is BFO, completely different than blood flow restriction training, and fraught with huge risk, major potentials of blood clots and hypertensive crisis, and it's just a nightmare. And I don't really understand how they're getting away with this. And it really frightens me because it's such a powerful tool, and it seems to be my take on it is because these pre-existing devices existed, which are not expensive. They're probably in the range of the price of the new KAATSU unit, and so they were very competitively advanced before the new one came out. But that would be the only advantage. And it seems like these companies are trying to take advantage of that and dual purpose their devices. So what's your take on and explain in more detail what the dangers are?
Yes. So I always explain it very easily. Is I have no problem putting this on my parents. Again, back in 2001, that was the initial
the KAATSU device.
The KAATSU device, yes.
Oh, and let's take a little tangent because I'm really curious. How are your parents doing, and how old are they?
Oh, they're 82 and 83. They use KAATSU daily, sometimes twice a day. They have their own unit. I could tell you all kinds of anecdotal things that went well, improved with them. Their muscular form is great. They're very active. My mother uses it in the pool and for her arthritis. My father uses it for his varicose veins and while riding a bike. So they use it in a variety of forms, and they've really been my guinea pigs. I knew if I could get my parents to use this, that safely in the comfort of their own home without any problems. Both my parents have had cancer, and they are doing quite well. And every time we develop a new product, they are part of our initiative.
The longest used elderly individuals of KAATSU in the United States, your parents.
Yes. So almost 20 years actually.
That is great.
And they've used KAATSU through hip replacements, knee replacements, etc. They do not go to a physical therapist after their surgeries. They just come home and they know how to use the KAATSU bands themselves. Now, of course, I've always been there with them. They live very close to me, so it's quite easy to implement.
That's wonderful, because we didn't mention it earlier, is that it's a wonderful tool for post-surgical rehabilitation and really regaining the function in a fraction of the time that you would normally anticipate.
Correct. But going back to your issue about the difference between the competitive products that are espoused and used by physical therapists and KAATSU, we have to go back to the original intention of Dr. Sato. The original intention of Dr. Sato was literally for every person on planet Earth, anywhere, anytime, to be able to do KAATSU. And that's a difficult bar to hit. We had to make sure that it was safe to use for every person on this planet. Now, I'm not saying that every person on the planet will want to use this or should use it, but that is that was our engineering goal, to make a product that you could use whatever age in the comfort of your own home without a medical practitioner actually applying it. And so that we had to make. Rule number one is very safe. Rule number two, easy to use. Rule number three is the person motivated to continue to sustain KAATSU. Because if we make a product that's safe, if we make a product that they could use at their own home, but they're not motivated to continue their rehabilitation or their training program, then we haven't achieved our goal. And so we set out to engineer a product that was easy to use and effective at the same time. And therefore, when other products come on the market and you have to go to your physical therapist and you have to use your own medical insurance to get reimbursed or pay for this, we believe that is the bar for global adoption. And so we've been very careful, and that's why our very original patients who are using this were among the most vulnerable patients possible. Those with heart attacks, strokes, clots, and other had undergone other cardiac surgery. And if it was safe for them, we knew that it would be safe for most people on this planet.
Yeah. Essentially, there's no restrictions for use of this product, as I understand. I mean, it's safe for just about everyone, even pregnant women.
Yes. So in the United States, we do not sell to pregnant women because if,
for the liability risk,
something happened, it would be easy to point to us. But in Japan, that's not an issue. And that people have to understand, when they put the bands on, it's just 20 seconds of pressure on, and then it releases. It's a very momentary amount of pressure that's done, and it always starts off very, very gently. And you can put it as high as you wish. And part of our company ethos is actually to teach people how to apply it to themselves safely, because we want people to use it in the comfort of their own home, in their office cubicle, during travel, vacation, business trips, etc.
All right, well, let's delve into the two types of KAATSU training that are available. The one is what pretty much you've been referring to this entire conversation, which is cycling, and then the training mode. Now, cycling means it's going on and off, 20 seconds on, 5 seconds off, although with some units you can vary that cycle. And that's usually 8 repetitions, although you could use 4. But with the training, it's continuously inflated and you're doing heavy exercise. So I'm curious, I didn't realize, but it sounded like when Sato was doing this prior to the mechanized system was available, he was essentially cycling with the elastic bands. Is that true?
Correct. So
that's crazy.
Yes, that's why it was so laborious. You'd have one patient that would do, let's say, 20 minutes on the upper body and 20 minutes on the lower body, but that would mean that Dr. Sato would be wrapping the band on both limbs every approximately 20 to 30 seconds and unwrapping them. Wow. Wrapping them again, unwrapping, wrapping them.
No wonder why he's so fit. He was working out like crazy for years.
Yes. And so that process, the KAATSU cycle, that was actually started in 1973. And I always enjoy this story. Dr. Sato went on a skiing trip. He broke his ankle. And he instinctively knew or thought or theorized that KAATSU would be helpful for his bones to heal. Now, he comes from a long line of physicians. And his father said, come into the hospital, we'll take care of you. And he, being sort of the rebellious young son, said, no, I'm just going to treat myself with KAATSU.
Because he's not, just to be clear, Dr. Sato is not a medical doctor, he's a PhD.
He did not go to medical school, correct. So he wrapped his leg with the bands as he normally did. And because there was so much blood pooling in the broken, in the area where his ankle was broken, it was very discomforting. And so he unwrapped it after about 30 seconds. And he says, well, there's a lot of blood going to the injured part. That's a good thing. So I'm going to wrap it again. So that was the catalyst for this KAATSU cycle. And they've been doing that for decades now. However, what you are referring to is KAATSU training. And KAATSU training is when you don't want to be tethered to a machine.
Yep.
And you want to go out for a walk. You're a boxer and you're boxing in the gym. You're a swimmer in a pool. You are a cyclist. And so in this case, we inflate the bands to what we call your optimal pressure, whatever the appropriate pressure is for you. And you can untether yourself from the machine and go ahead and do whatever exercise or motion that you want. And we recommend that is limited to 20 minutes. And ideally, if you're doing this between, I would say, 7 and 12 minutes, it's very healthy and very good for you.
Okay. Perhaps you can elaborate on when you would use each type. It seems to me that the training mode might be better suited if you're interested in gaining muscle mass and strength as the cycling, although they're probably pretty similar with some of the other metabolic hormonal benefits. That's my impression, but I don't know. You're really the pioneer in bringing it to the United States. So
it really depends on the individual. So if you have somebody who's bedridden, if you have someone who is just beginning a training program, they may be overweight, they may be deconditioned for whatever reason. Maybe they're coming off of a broken bone or surgery. They're not going to go to a gym. They might not even want to lift dumbbells. So in this case, we can do the KAATSU cycle and just ask them to move their limbs very slowly as they contract their muscles. And so that has the same effect as taking off the bands. Taking off the tubes, untethering the bands, and just doing what we call KAATSU training and lifting the dumbbells. So many of our athletes, they love working out in a gym. That's what they love to do. They don't want to have a machine tethered to them. So in these people's cases, they untether and they go ahead and do their own training as they normally do.
Yeah. Let me attempt to give people a visual, because this tethering is obvious if you've seen it, but if you haven't, it might be a bit complex. So the KAATSU device that you developed, especially the new one the size of a deck of cards, is attached to two plastic, very flexible tubes that actually go to the restriction bands. And the device itself is a pump that pumps air into it. It gets to the right pressure that you preset at. But you've got these long tubes that could be up to 3 feet long, and it can be kind of cumbersome if you're moving around the gym. I mean, you could attach it to your belt or in your pocket, but it's still, it's still a bit of a hassle. So you can separate it and then remove it from that, and the band will retain the pressure.
Correct.
So another interesting distinction I want to bring up, because I've tried a lot of different systems, and you could go even at $800 for the new KAATSU. It's still, some people may find it too expensive and search for some less expensive ones, and they do exist. You can go on Amazon and find them. But what I've seen is that they're more similar to the blood pressure cuffs. In other words, they're not elastic, they're too wide, and they use a blood pressure cuff machine. They're not manual, so it's really difficult to do the cycling. And even more, I've noticed is that when you use the blood pressure cuff, the manual pump that they use for those, you can't get it accurately. It just goes up and then it falls, and it's really hard to get it tuned in. Where with KAATSU, it's a digital system. You type in to the number, the single digit, what your pressure needs to be, and boom, it goes right there. It couldn't be more simpler.
Correct.
So it's so elegant. There's no other system in the world that does that right now.
Correct. And that is our goal. Dr. Sato entrusted myself and my colleagues to share this information with the rest of the world. He entrusted us with his intellectual property to develop products that were easy to use, that were safe to use, that are effective to use. And again, my database, my test group, if you will, are people my parents' age. And if I can get an 80-year-olds to use a digital product easily and simply, and they can replicate that day after day, then we've achieved the goal that Dr. Sato set out for us.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that assessment. And you've created a device that is essentially available to almost everyone. Now, I'm going to propose an alternative because I was very skeptical with this, and certainly not willing to make an outlay to invest in this equipment. At the price that at the time the least expensive device was over $2,000. So now it's less than half that, and still some people will find that too big of a challenge. Although realistically, I mean, and there's some other investments. If you don't have weights, you're going to have to get weights, so that might be another 100, 200, maybe even $300, depending on what range of weights you want to acquire. But free weights, typically dumbbells. But the toe in the water, so to speak, are elastic bands that you could buy for $15 on your arm, and they're Velcro attached, so they literally can go on in about 2 seconds, as opposed to Dr. Sato used to, prior to the device. I mean, he'd be wrapping that thing. It took a lot longer than 2 seconds. This may be even a second. And so you could actually even do cycling with this if you wanted to. It's a lot easier, of course, to do training because you only have to put it on once. But I think, in my view, at $15 is a very low risk investment to at least see if something that you think you can commit to. And once you get comfortable with it and you say, wow, this is crazy good, then you could take the next step and get the KAATSU equipment. It's sort of like a trial. What's your take on that?
Obviously, we always want people to use pneumatic systems.
Yes, that's the best. There's no
That is the best, and it's the safest. So anybody can, how they find their way to KAATSU is up to them. They could try something else. They could go to, right now, because there's so many units out there, not only our units, but other competitive units. You can try anything. We always tell people, hey, try everything that you want. Again, Dr. Sato entrusted us to share KAATSU with the world. We know that we could not possibly have 100% market share. So we'd like people to do research and provide products. We just are hopeful that our solution is the best, and some people will be willing to pay for it, and some people cannot. And so, we're hopeful that however way they get to KAATSU, they'll find us there. And if it requires a test.
Well, the reason I mentioned that is that these elastic bands do meet the two criteria. They're thin, they're 1.5 inches wide, so they're not the wide ones, and they're not static. They're dynamic. They stretch.
Right.
So the risk of having a hypertensive crisis or a blood clot is almost identical to the KAATSU. It's not as good because you're not going to be able to be as precise. You're not going to get the cycling as precise, but you should get benefits with virtually no risk, and at least enough to be intrigued with the process to make the investment.
Yes. So again, how people find their way to us is great. We're just very thankful. Again, Dr. Sato entrusted us, the KAATSU global team, to share this invention with the world. And thank you, Dr. Mercola, for first of all trying it, and on yourself at your home and walking on the beach, etc. And we love for people to take the same path as you did.
Yeah, well, my initial strategy was to try it with bands that were not effective. I used the wrong bands, and they actually were somewhat risky, although I'm pretty healthy, so it wasn't a big of a deal. But if I had a stroke or a heart attack, and I had really poor clotting factors, that could have been an issue. It could have taken me out early. So I think, but if you use the smaller bands, I think it's fine. And at least it works. And then it's a commitment. But realistically, at the price point now, it's less expensive than almost any large piece of gym equipment, like a treadmill or a recumbent bike, stationary bike that you pick up. I mean, they're going to be probably more expensive, especially or an elliptical machine. I mean, these are all pieces of equipment that are typically well over $1,000. So, and in my view, in most every case, is a pretty serious mistake and a really poor investment. If you're doing it to improve your health, and this is coming from someone who exercised for hardcore cardio for over 4 decades. So I'm not saying it without some substantiation and personal experience. And I regret doing that I think it's a poor investment in use of your time. I think you're going to get far better benefits, especially these metabolic benefits. Now, you get some from cardio, but you're not going to get the same ones, and you're not going to get the same benefits, especially as you age. When this becomes, the older you are, the more important this becomes, which is why I was so curious to how it was working for your parents.
Correct. And we always tell people, yes, it's $800, but we have this product that people should use and can use twice a day. Let's just assume that you go on vacation, you have some days that you may not use it, so you're using it 300 days a year. If you're using it twice a day, that's about $2.50 a use. Now, if that eliminates the need for you to leave your home and go to a fitness gym and come back, this cost savings is significant.
Yeah, as opposed to a gym membership for most people. Now, I do want to interject too that in my view, at least, and especially reviewing the literature and knowing a lot of competitive athletes, that I think there is benefit to do both.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
that if you are a serious competitive athlete, you just don't want to do KAATSU and nothing else. You do your whole entire regimen, which may include and should include conventional strength training, but the combination of both of them is beyond extraordinary.
Absolutely. We always say that KAATSU is a great overlay, a great addition, a great enhancer to those people who are competitive athletes, who are, you could be someone who wants to make a varsity team in high school or college, Olympics, pros, whatever. Do what you do to make you the best that you can be, and get that advantage with KAATSU.
Yeah. It's, in my view, the use of it for competitive athletes is a really small percentage of its value. I mean, it's great, but who cares? I mean, this is something that can radically transform the healthcare system, because we all need exercise. There's no question about it. The older you are, the more you need this, and it will not necessarily. It should improve your lifespan, but more importantly, it's going to improve your health span. In other words, it's going to keep you healthier, longer, free from disease, fully mobile, not frail, being able to have your normal daily activities and move around like you were designed to, and actually improve your mental clarity and acuity. So it does. These metabolic benefits are profound. One of my passions is NAD, which is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, a very important coenzyme in your body that has become more recently appreciated in the last decade. Some of the work out at Harvard and MIT on sirtuins, the longevity proteins. Well, the exercise in general, but specifically blood flow restriction training in KAATSU, can increase your NAD levels by 30%, and there's no charge. Some of these NAD supplements and precursors, they're like $1, $2 a day. And this is, that alone can justify the cost of the equipment, because you're not paying for expensive supplements, because you're having your body make this. And it does work. And we've got documented studies where just the exercise, nothing else, will increase your NAD levels. And that we know has profound influence on your health span. So it's just a miracle in a box is what it is. And I couldn't be more passionate about encouraging people to consider this as one of the most valuable tools in their armamentarium to keep themselves healthy for the long term. And one of my greatest disappointments in life is that I failed to find this prior to my parents passing away a few years ago. And I did encounter it while they were still alive, but it never clicked. I never got it until 2 years later. At that time, they were already gone. So I'm sure it could have added another 5 or 10 years to their life and improve their quality to ambulate and not be restricted to a walker or a wheelchair.
Yes. Yeah. And again, that was my original goal. How can I help my own parents as they age to remain as active in my children's life, their grandchildren's lives as possible? And it's so far proved an immense benefit.
Yeah, that's a noble goal, and I congratulate you for doing that and really serving your parents well. I think that's what ultimately one of our responsibilities is. I believe there's a lot of good support for that, to respect your parents and take care of them like they took care of you. They brought you into this world, and you need to make sure they're well taken care of as they age. And one of the best things you can do is make sure that they maintain their health and be with them, because here's another important part that is many people don't understand. But when you become frail, when you lose muscle mass and you go into the hospital, you radically increase your risk of not coming out of the hospital alive. I mean, the risk of complications and disasters when you have low muscle mass and you're frail is enormous. So if you need this reserve, and if you don't have the reserve when you go in, you're not going to come out. So not only do you have to have the reserve, but then of course you, as a child of your parents, you want to go in with them or make sure someone else is in the hospital, because the hospital is a very dangerous place, and there's a good chance you may not come out alive just from a simple, stupid mistake, not intentional mistake, and it doesn't matter. Once you're dead, you're dead. So someone's got to help you and monitor you and make sure that no one's injecting something that shouldn't be there or giving you medicine that was someone else's or the wrong strength or dose. I mean, it's a dangerous place. So, but having muscle mass improved by the KAATSU or blood flow restriction training is one of the most important strategies in my viewpoint to keep yourself healthy and out of the hospital. But if you ever happen to go in, you're more likely to come out alive.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to express my deep and sincerest appreciations and gratitude for all the persevering work you did in bringing this incredible tool to the United States. I mean, it takes a rare individual to do that. I truthfully, I wouldn't have done it. I absolutely would not have done it. I would have not gone to Japan 4 times a year for 13 years if I was able to get it into the US. That was just too big a barrier for me, but I'm glad I didn't have to do it and you did it. So,
and I'm glad I did it. It was a long road.
Yeah, it was a very long road. And I think it's important for people to understand that, because they think, oh, this is some marketing gimmick they're trying to hype. No, this decades and decades and decades and engineering reiteration to get this thing at a price point where it's affordable, and usable and available to almost everyone. So congratulations and thanks for all your efforts.
Thank you. And I have to tell you, I didn't know the end of the road. Dr. Sato surprised me in around the 13th year. He said, okay, now you're ready.
and my guess is, and maybe you can comment on this, I think that's an artifact of the Japanese culture.
Yes.
It's because that would not happen in America. So can you comment on that, or maybe?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I learned the Japanese way of thought, their social protocols, the expectations of the respect between different levels of society. And I knew, or I had hoped, that at some point Dr. Sato would say, yes, you're ready, except whether you're a young person trying to be a sushi chef, a young person trying to be a Japanese sword master, a kimono maker, it doesn't matter. You don't know what that length of mentorship will be, or apprenticeship will be. If you're good, it might only be 8 years. If you're not so good, it might be 18 years. In my particular case, it was 13 years. And so
that's crazy, because in medical school, which is one of the most rigorous academic training professions, if you don't count medical school, I mean, it's typically a minimum of 3, but some cases 8 years. I mean, I don't know of many places where it's longer than 8 years as a residency program, but you did 13. So that's great. All right. Well, thanks again.
Yes.
And, we're going to make this information available. And I hope one of my goals now is to really help everyone understand this and make sure they are aware that it's an available option that can radically change your life.
Thank you very much again.
All right.